Okay, so this video is going to be called something in the realm of despotism versus Fordism. And I'll just start trying to get into the thought process that I've been having on this subject. But there's basically two forms of business. There's despotism and Fordism. There's business that is built on noticing some everyday problem and then building a solution around that problem, and then building more and more efficient ways of creating the material means and mechanical means of efficient solution. And then there's essentially business models that are based around noticing, for instance, let's say you were to be outfitting all the Ford cars in Haverhill for police cars. That's more of a despotic business model. I mean, it's something that needs to be done, but again, these businesses are businesses like that are just the logical conclusion of things that need to be done in society. And ultimately, it doesn't really constitute business any more than painting my house constitutes business. Painting my house is just a chore, and you can pay people for a chore. But when you start getting businesses that are built around the intimidation of people into not doing chores, or into monopoly ownership of chore ownership rights or something, it gets incredibly despotic incredibly quickly. And that's really what we have in our society today. If I wanted to go build a road, oh my God, the amount of despotism that goes on in the transportation industry is crazy. It gets hard to separate out literally what is despotism from what is regulation. Let's just assume for the sake of the video that all regulation is despotism. Because basically, in order to deal with regulation, you have to okay, so let's say Elon Musk. This is something Elon's been talking about. He's been talking about how he's been making starships, and in order to make his starships operate, he has to get government approval, not to make them operate, but in order to operate his starship company, he has to get government approval on where they're going to land in the ocean. So he has to conduct studies to make sure that his starships are not going to hit dolphins or whales or sharks. But the government wouldn't give him the information because they were worried that the information was going to be used to illegally hunt sharks. So he was in this incredibly bizarre scenario, and still maybe there's all this, which is really great because they're making the Department of Government Efficiency, the DOGE, which is going to go around getting rid of inefficient government agencies. Because, again, the degree of despotism is crazy. And it's well, why do these agencies end up so despotic? And not the least of it is the fact that they keep giving themselves jobs. They have no real purpose after their purpose has been fulfilled. So then they just keep creating purposes for themselves. Something that my dad said when I was younger that really stuck with me is a lot of these politicians just keep passing laws because they need to justify their own existence. And anytime you get a situation where you're trying to have the government actually fix a problem, you're basically just creating despotism. You're creating despotism because the only thing the government can do is have people with guns show up somewhere to arrest people. That's pretty much it. What else can the government actually do? The government doesn't install the water lines. The government doesn't make the roads. The government doesn't make the electrical lines. What does the government actually do? So, they hire private companies for this. So the government really sits there and basically prevents anyone who isn't approved from doing this stuff. And now there's reasons for doing that. But the point is that the only reasons for doing that are basically that people are stupid and they can't self-organize without government. I mean, ultimately, government and state itself exists in the absence of a people. When you have a unified people with a unified will, you don't need a state. You don't need a government. A family is not a government because it is a family. It is an actual unit. The more a family relies on governmental type systems, the less it is a family. I mean, this is very obvious. It's if you have to get the police to make your kids behave, they're not really your kids. They're more like the state's kids. So, and this is kind of how the state actually views it as well. But again, with all the laws that are coming out, your kids may get arrested for starting their own lemonade stand. And this is where the despotism comes in. The despotism comes in anytime the government prevents people from doing anything that it need not prevent, which is almost all of the things that it does to some degree. I mean, especially at a federal level. Like, I think that potentially like food safety regulations, I don't know. I mean, we really need to look at these government agencies, because now that technology has advanced, our ability to actually monitor what goes on, what goes into our food, and have widespread dissemination of information is increasing dramatically. So, do we still need all these government agencies and stuff?
Part of the issue is when you rely on the government, and you're like, oh, don't worry, the government's protecting me. Now you're relying on the discernment on what's good, what's not good. And they think magnesium stearate, which is actually a toxic soap, is good for you. And that's why they allow it in your supplements. They think
crazy.
Like Red 40 is good for you, which is why
Well,
they
you don't
allow
care.
it.
And it's like also the cosmetics, like what goes on your skin, completely unregulated. So I don't really think it's an issue.
A lot of people
though.
also take it and they're like, well, it's FDA approved, it must not be like bad for me.
Hey, how's it going, Kenzie?
They take it and like, it's
Oh, it's my
FDA.
brother Jason, by the way.
Hi.
Sorry if you're wondering.
They're like, it's FDA approved. It must be like, it must not be poison. No, you're actually just taking poison. Like,
Yeah.
this stuff's slowly killing you.
Well, yeah, exactly. So the FDA, it doesn't actually prevent you from consuming poison. They just make sure that there are plenty of potentially biasly funded studies done on the poison. And
Yeah, but I feel like a lot of people don't even check into the shit themselves because they're like, oh, someone else is doing it. Like, that's the FDA's job. And then they're like, oh, wait, the FDA isn't fucking doing their job? Like, what the hell is that? And then you wake up to all this shit and you're like, oh, I still need to watch out for myself because even though we gave away a bunch of our rights, the government still won't protect us. from
okay,
anything.
yeah. And then here's where the despotism gets really crazy. So phenylpiracetam and the racetam class of nootropics are not legal in the United States, despite the fact that they're basically OTC in Russia, and they're incredibly useful
OTC.
over the counter. And they're incredibly well tested and efficacious. So the problem is that the FDA isn't preventing you from consuming toxic substances, and they're actually preventing you from consuming things that would be beneficial because those things haven't been it's kind of nonsense. It's just, it's arbitrary. It's literally, it's systematized arbitrariness.
Yeah, but also being heavily lobbied by pharmaceutical companies who don't want the natural compounds to readily be available or the new substances because they sell way more expensive drugs that do a similar thing but with some side effects.
Oh, yeah. So that's basically the government-enforced drug cartel, which is a monopoly. A government-enforced monopoly.
The modern drug companies can't, like, they can't trademark or patent piracetam to sell because it's already out there. So if they had it legal to sell in the U.S., anyone could sell it. But what they can do is they can make their own version of the drug that has a couple side effects. They can sell that to you because they can patent it.
Or what they can do is they're only going to legalize their version of it. They're going to make a patented synthesis and then say only this version of it's legal and you can't synthesize it any other way. And then try to control access to it that way. And really the problem with this is that it prevents human thought and innovation. And human thought and innovation is the only thing that actually creates value in the world. Value doesn't come from government regulation, obviously. Value comes from people actually doing work and trying things and seeing what works. And the problem is that government comes into existence as a result of this prosperity, feeding off of the prosperity, and then regulates the prosperity to death in order to pay for itself and prevent essentially like challenges to the system. Because it's like, oh, we don't want people to consume these things because that could be dangerous. Well, what's the danger of not allowing your population to explore all of the best treatments for neurological diseases? Oh, a society of dying people. Well, that doesn't sound to me like that's a risk worth taking, especially seeing as the only reason we have a society that's prosperous enough to the point where we even think that that's a viable option is the fact that people were free enough to do these experiments until the government agencies came into effect Like, the only reason we have all these regulations around pharmaceuticals is because pharmaceuticals were developed by unregulated people to such a degree that they became so useful that we were like, holy shit, there are actually these things called pharmaceuticals that are so powerful that they should be regulated.
Yeah,
those were created by unregulated people.
You kind of had to allow for the snake juice to be there so that people could figure out what is actually snake juice.
Yeah, like
and what's
snake
useful.
oil. Snake
snake
juice
oil,
is
yeah.
good electrolytes. But yeah, no, exactly. You have to allow the snake oil to be there so people can know what is and what is not snake oil. And I mean, people should test stuff. People should, like, there should be accountability, but the accountability shouldn't come in the form of the government stepping in and creating a government enforced monopoly that halts development, because that ultimately isn't good for anyone. That's not good for it cuts off its own head, because it's more concerned with preventing things from happening than from creating opportunity. And you can't prevent yourself into a good situation. Like, if you want to have a good relationship with your wife, you can't, like, say, okay, I'm just never going to argue with her. You have to, like, create a good relationship by, like, working on yourself and, like, having a dream that you believe in and, like, working towards that. If you just never argue, you're basically just never communicating. So that's basically what our society is doing. Is saying, okay, everything will be fine so long as no one innovates at all. Like, we can't innovate. We can only allow these companies that already have a monopoly and these industries that are already incredibly regulated and standardized to continue doing slightly different versions of what they're doing within the same criteria. And if this doesn't work at all, we're just going to basically increase government subsidization of these industries. Literally, that's literally what they're doing. They're just going to they're subsidizing the industries because they're preventing them from actually growing by regulating them to death. Okay.